Hello, welcome to Prism Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 10 of ASP.NET video series. In this video, we'll discuss about loading standard ASP.NET controls dynamically. We'll also discuss about simple tips and tricks to maintain the state of these dynamically added controls across a post bag. In the previous session of this video series, we have discussed about loading user controls dynamically. In this video, we'll discuss about loading the standard ASP.NET controls dynamically. What we actually want to achieve is, a user will be presented with a drop-down list here. This drop-down list is present on the web form at design time with two choices. The user can choose to select a city, in which case a drop-down list will be displayed, and this drop-down list, the city drop-down list, is dynamically added to the web form. And then from this dynamically added control, the user can select a city. And then when I click the button, look at this, upon post back, this drop down list is able to maintain its state, and at the same time I'm able to also retrieve the value from that drop down list. But on the other hand, if the user chooses to enter postcode instead of the drop down list, a text box is displayed where the user can enter a postcode. And when I click the button, look at this, upon post back, the text box is able to retain its state, and at the same time I am also able to retrieve the value from the text box, upon post back. Okay, the text box and the drop down list are dynamically added to this web form. So let's see how to achieve this. So I have a web form here, web form 8.aspx. On this web form, at the moment I only have this drop down list and the list items within the drop down list. So if you look at this drop down list, it has got three list items. Please select, that's the first option with a value of -1, and then select a city where we have specified the value is DDL, because for the user to select a city, we want to display a drop down list, and for enter postcode we have specified the value as TB for text box. Okay, so and then we have also set the auto postback property to true for this drop down list. So obviously when I run this and when the user selects city, now what we want to do, when the drop down list posts back to the server automatically, we want to add a drop down list. Okay, so let's see how to do that. So this is the drop down list. Double click to generate the event handler drop down list 1 underscore selected index change. Now if in drop down list 1 the selected value, if the selected value, look at that, in the source, if the selected value is DDL, then we want to dynamically add a drop down list. Okay, so if drop-down list dot selected value is DDL, what we want to do, we want to create a drop-down list object. So DDL drop-down list DDL is equal to new drop-down list. Give it a meaningful ID so that later we can retrieve the values from the drop-down list, selected values from the drop-down list using that ID. So I'm going to specify the ID as, let's say, DDL1 for example. And then we want to add items, list items to this drop down list, examples of some cities. So I'm going to say ddl.items dot add. Now if you're new to drop down list, we have a video recorded on the basics of drop down list in the previous sessions in this video series. I would strongly recommend to watch those videos first. But look at this, I want to add a list item here, but there is another method where we can simply add the list item as a string. So I'm going to specify New York is one of the city, and along the same lines let's add two more cities. I'm going to say New Jersey and maybe Washington DC. Okay, so I have three cities added as list items to the drop down list. Finally, we want to add this drop down list to this web form. Okay, now on this web form I want the drop down list to be added after this drop down list. So I'm going to have a break element after the initial drop down list and then another drop down list here. So let me no, we want to add this drop down list dynamically to the web form, and I want to add the city drop down list at this location. So obviously we need a placeholder control there. So let me drag and drop the placeholder control. So the ID of the placeholder control is placeholder 1, and then after that we want a button control which the user can click to retrieve the value from that drop down list. So let me go ahead and add a button control. Okay, so now let's flip to the design mode, and then to this placeholder control we want to add our drop down list. So I'm going to say placeholder one dot controls collection dot add. What do we want to add? We want to add the drop down list object. Okay, so done. On the other hand, else if the drop down list, in the drop down list, if the selected value is equal to text box, if the user has chosen to enter the postcode, then the selected value will be text box, in which case we want to add a text box dynamically. So text box tb is equal to new text box, and then we want to give it an ID, so tb.id is equal to, I'm going to say tb1 maybe, and then I don't want any kind of text within that, and I simply want to add that to the web form. So placeholder one dot controls dot add, and we want to add text box. That's it. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this at this point and then see what's the behavior. Okay, so the web form should load up now. Let me go ahead and select city. Look at that, I'm able to select, I have the drop down list here. On the other hand, if I enter postcode, look at that, text box is rendered, so very fine. But there are problems with this web form as it stands right now. Look at this, I select city, city drop down list is rendered, and then I can select a city from the drop down list. Let's say I select Washington DC. Now when I click this button, what should happen? I should retain the values in this dynamically generated text box across a postback. But let me click that and see what's going to happen. Look at that, as soon as I click the button, the dynamically generated control is vanished, and it makes sense. That's because, look at this, when are you actually adding these controls dynamically? When the selected index changed is raised for the drop down list one control. Now look at this, when the selected index changes here, it's adding them finally, fine. But then when I click this button, what's going to happen? The web form will post back to the server. And within the button click event, look at this, let's double click that to generate the event handler. Within the button click event, we are not doing anything, and within the page load event, nothing is happening. The controls are added dynamically only when this event is raised. When I click the button, obviously drop down list one selected index changed event is not raised, so obviously these controls will not be there present on the web form. And another thing to keep in mind, the reason why these controls are not persisted across a postback is because now web forms work on a stateless protocol. We have discussed about this in part 2 or 3, I don't remember the part number, but we have discussed this in the previous sessions of this ASP.NET video series. Web applications work on a stateless protocol, so every request is kind of like a new request to the web server, and then the web server is going to recreate an instance of this web form and all the controls on that web form from the scratch once again. Okay, so obviously when I click this button, it does not know anything about this. The web server doesn't know anything about this web form 8 until a new request goes to the web server. On the web server, it's going to recreate an instance of this web form 8 class. So this web form 8 class will be created, page load event will be processed, and then in the page load we don't have any code, so nothing is going to happen. But then within the button click event, again we don't have any code, so it just renders the web form with that drop down list, the drop down list that we had at design time, which is this specific drop down list. Okay, but then when I select any item within this drop down list that I have here, at this point what happens? Another request goes, request for web form 8, so it's going to create an instance of this web form again, and then within the page load event we don't have any code, so nothing happens. But then after that, this selected index changed event of the drop down list one is executed, in which case if you have selected enter postcode, the selected value is text box, so it's going to create that instance of the text box, specify an ID, and add it to the web form. And that's how we have these controls properly generated when the selected index changed event of drop down list one is fired. But then when I click this button, look at that, they get vanished. Okay, so let us see how to a simple tips and tricks to basically retain the state of these dynamically generated controls across postback, so that we can retrieve values from them and then save it to the database. Okay, so the trick I'm going to follow here is I'm going to add these controls. I'm going to move this piece of code from drop down list one underscore selected index changed event to the page load event. Okay, so that's the first thing that we'll do. and then I'm going to knock off these conditions because I want these controls to be generated every time. Okay, and then this is not properly formatted. To properly format that, I'm going to select the entire code and then press Ctrl K and D. That's going to format that automatically for us. So that's formatted properly now. But what I'm going to do right now is, look at this. On the page load event of the web form, these controls are added dynamically, but we don't want them to be visible when the web page loads up. So I'm going to set the visibility of both the controls to false. So ddl.visible is equal to false, and along the same lines I'm going to set the visibility of the text box also to false. Okay, so we have set the visibility of these controls to false, but then let me run this as it stands right now. Look at that. At the moment, within the drop-down list 1 selected and exchanged, we don't have any code. All the code, we have moved it to the page load event. And what's the modification we made? We made both the controls invisible by setting the visible property to false. So when I select city here, nothing basically happens. Why is that? Because there is no code within the selected and exchanged event of the drop-down list 1. But what I want to do right now is to change the visibility of these controls within the page load event. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is, if drop-down list 1 dot selected value is equal to, if the selected value is drop-down list, then what we want to do, we want to turn the visibility on for that drop-down list. So ddl.visible is equal to true. Else, if the drop-down list 1 selected value is text box, then we want to turn the visibility of that text box. So tb.visible is equal to true. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run this, and as you might expect, only the visibility of that selected control will be changed. Look at this. Now if I select city, the drop down list is shown here, and then if I select text box, if I choose enter postcode, then the text box is shown. Now the most important thing to keep in mind here is, look at that, I'm going to enter a postcode there and then click the button. Look at that, on the postback it's actually retaining its state, which is very important. Okay, and then if I select city, I'm going to select Washington DC. I click this button. Look at that, across postback it's still retaining its state. Now finally, what we want to do on this button click, we want to retrieve the selected value within the drop down list and the selected value within the text box. Let's see how to do that now. So within the button click event, what I'm going to do, look at the IDs of these controls. The IDs are TB1, and for the drop down list it's DDL1. Okay, so I'm going to copy this piece of code from here, and then when the button click event happens, if the selected value is DDL, which means if it's drop down list, then what we want to do, we want to retrieve the value from that drop down list control. So how do I do that? Now another important thing to keep in mind, this drop down list, the drop down list and the text box controls that we are adding dynamically, we are adding them to placeholder control. Okay, so obviously within the placeholder control we have to look for the drop down list and the text box controls. So what I'm going to do here, if the selected value is drop down list, I'm going to say placeholder 1 control. Within that, find a control with ID. What's the ID of the drop down list? If you remember, it's DDL1. So DDL1. So this find control method will return the drop down list as a control, but we know that we are getting a drop down list back. So I'm going to typecast that to drop down list type, and then finally retrieve the selected items text from that drop down list. So how do I do that? So from the drop down list, selected item dot text, and then once we have that value, all we want to do is print that out onto the web form, but in reality we may save it to a database table. Okay, so along the same lines, if the selected value within the drop down list is the text box, then what do I want to do? Let me copy this piece of code and then paste that here. But if the selected value is text box, we know that we are looking for a control within the placeholder with an ID of TB1, but that's going to be a text box, so we have to typecast that to be of type text box. and then retrieve the value that the user has typed into the text box using the text property, and then print that on the web form. That's it, we are done. Let me go ahead and run this at this moment, and we should be able to, select city. So that's the drop down list. Let me select New Jersey and click the button. Look at that, I'm able to retrieve the value across postback, and the control is still maintaining its state. Along the same lines, enter postcode. Let me say 20411. I click the button, and it should retain its state across, and we should be able to retrieve the value as well. Okay, and let's do a little bit of cleanup here. There's no reason why we need this specific drop down list one selected changed event handler, so I'm going to get rid of that from there. And then also let's remove the event handler hooking within the ASPX page, so I can get rid of this event. Okay, so now the behavior will be exactly same, except that we have cleaned it up a little bit. And if you look at the code, it's very simple code. All you are doing is within the page load, you are adding the controls dynamically, and you are setting the visibility to false. And depending on the drop down list selection, you turn the visibility on for those respective controls. But then in reality, in some of your projects, if you don't have, here for the drop down list, for this drop down list one, the view state is preserved automatically for us because this control is present at the design time. Okay, so its view state is maintained for us across that web form, across a post back. Okay, but in reality, if you don't have a UI control which is going to maintain the state for you, which is going to remember what control the user wants, then probably you can store that in a view state variable on that page. Okay, and then later when the web form loads up on a post back, you can retrieve that value from that view state variable, and then decide which control you want to dynamically show, whose properties you want to dynamically change. So to maintain the state of controls across post back, add the controls in the page load event and set their visibility to false. Based on the drop down list selection here, we are showing or hiding the visibility of that control dynamically. Okay. So on this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.